In EDH, the term group slug is often used to describe decks that deal damage to their opponents evenly. They frequently do that through effects that punish players for taking certain game actions, like Nekuzar, which damages opponents when they draw cards. You can see how this overlaps with group hug. If an opponent draws more cards, they take more damage. In Pauper Commander, there are far fewer punishment effects, so the term is more often used as an antonym for group hug decks. Instead of drawing everyone cards like Howling Golem, group slug decks force their opponents to discard cards, sacrifice creatures, and wipe the board. I like this definition for our format because the best analogs to EDH's Punisher effects that define their version of group slug are Suture Priest, Bloodseeker, and Trespasser's Curse. And that's a pretty short list, so it would be pretty useless as a definition in Pauper Commander. Additionally, there aren't great ways to give opponents creatures, so the overlap with group hug would have been lost as part of the definition. A common suggestion at this point in the conversation is to call what is defined as group slug as Stax instead. There's an entire article on cpdh.guide by Clay and Finhorn Brownie that goes over this. It references an article on MTG Salvation from 2005. To summarize, Stax originated as the name of a vintage deck. It was an acronym for the $4,000 solution, which described the price tag of the deck and how it used all of the most expensive cards to be able to compete. The deck won by locking opponents out of the game by using cost increasers, land tappers, and land destruction like smokestacks. The easier to type term Stax is what stuck, and the definition grew to encompass cards that locked opponents out of the game or slowed them down, usually in terms of mana production or their ability to play cards. In Pauper Commander, there are 3 opponents, so land destruction isn't very effective, and there are essentially no tax effects, so Stax is used to describe things that disrupt opponents in other ways. Standard Bearer and Coalition Honor Guard disrupt targeting creatures. Phyrexian Censor or Eidolon of Relic are commanders that restrict the number of spells that can be cast in a turn, Oubliette and auras that remove abilities like Unable to Scream shut commanders off, and it can also include non-permanent effects like Fogs. If you think this is a stretch, you have not had to sit through Sporefrog or Stonehorn Dignitary Loop for long enough. Now that we have context for Group Slug and Stax, let's return to Suture Priest, Bloodseeker, and Trespasser's Curse. These effects that initially looked like EDH's Group Slug are permanents that make playing the game harder, especially for Flicker decks, or decks like Format Boogeyman Abdel, or my own Sphinx Summoner deck, which clearly makes them Stax, and not Group Slug. I might return to Stax as a topic in another video, but I want to discuss Group Slug today. I want to cover it first, because the reason that I went through all the trouble of writing a page-long definition for Group Slug is that I wanted to discuss mass discard. After all, if Group Slug is an antonym from Group Hug, which is defined by mass draw card, what could be more Group Slug than mass discard? The reason it's important to discuss is that I believe it's a trap in most cases. The big exception is Siphon Mind, and that's mostly because it's a draw 3. As someone who came from 60 card 1v1 formats, this seemed like a +5 on card advantage. Drawing 3 is +2, my opponent's discarding is +3, but that's not how a 4-player game works. Unlike 1v1, not every card is going to be pointed at you. In fact, there's a 2/3 chance that the removal spell they discarded would have gone to an opponent's creature, or it could have been an attacker that helps remove a problematic opponent. At this point, a person might say, "Sure, Siphon Mind isn't a 5-for-1, but mass discard still has to lower the overall power of my opponents, which is good, right?" I'm here to argue that no, it's still not worth it to force opponents to discard, unless it has the draw attached to it. It's expending resources to not affect the board, which is a hallmark sign of a bad card. It's hoping that eventually opponents will run out of resources if we pressure their hands, which doesn't usually work out. Every card slot in a deck is precious. I don't see it as representing one card in 100, it's more often 1/7 of an opening hand. If it was a card that fueled the deck's engine with mana or permanents instead, you could start getting returns on your investments. By that, I mean that every resource managed game has roughly the same premise. If those resources are used to acquire more resources, those resources can be fed back into the cycle to generate a larger amount of resources than if they were not invested. The best example is Simic. Green provides mana that blue can turn into cards. Those cards can help generate more mana until it's easy to overwhelm opponents. This card represents a black hole in a deck's card advantage engine, a complete loss of resources. It does not provide returns that can be fed back into an engine. Sure, the discard may be attached to a body that can be used as a resource, but not at the same rate. Imagine an opponent is playing the same deck but has a creature that says draw a card instead. They get the same benefits of a body, but get to forward their own game plan by drawing a land that might generate an extra mana for the rest of the game. Or better yet, something that actually wins the game. This is why I believe that mass discard does not benefit the person that plays it, it benefits the player with the strongest engine, and if adding mass discard decreases how likely a deck is to have the strongest engine, the more you add, the worse it gets, not even considering if you draw into it and your opponents are already empty-handed. Another reason has to do with how players decide which card to discard. The very last thing a player will discard is their way to win the game. It could be the land that they need to replay their commander, or a combo piece. Often this means that removal gets discarded, which could have been used to stop another player from winning. There are decks where it works though, and it's by studying these anomalies where we can sometimes learn the most. Abdel Agent of the Iron Throne lists frequently play Burglar Rat effects. I think this works because Abdel frequently is the archenemy by default, and the type of thing that I'm afraid of getting protected by others discard. It can also turn flickers into draw 5s, which is a strong enough engine to support it. Another discard deck is Hollow Marauder. I've played against it, watched, and spoken to players who've spent time on the deck, and my impression is that the commander is strong because it's drawing cards, and the discard is secondary. But the discard is not secondary to opponents, so it draws a lot of attention. As part of my research for this topic, I built a Demigoth Woe Eater deck. The idea was that I could game its first ability by not running any other creatures. I could use Grave Flickers to keep it alive from turn to turn, or sacrifice it in response to its ability using something like Village Rites. Opponents would have to kill my creature at sorcery speed, or wait until I tried to save it when I was most untapped. I believe I played 7 games with the deck, and I've never been so consistently shut down over and over playing any deck. During the game, I would try to explain that if they stopped me, they would be down a card, they'd be denying me a card, but the other 2 opponents would still have the cards that would have been discarded. They would even save the mana by not playing the removal. It didn't matter if I even promised not to send the commander at them. The common thread was that they saw that they were in a use it or lose it situation and wanted to deny me tempo. They would prefer that my commander cost as much as possible so that I wouldn't take another one of their cards, and they really only care about their own cards. Additionally, comparing Hollow Marauder to Demigoth Woe Eater, when the Woe Eater's discard ability actually does resolve, it only net 1 card, which was not enough to overpower the table. Papa Pauper of the Common Connoisseurs recently won a tournament with Hollow Marauder. He solved this issue by simply not including Grave Flickers. They would represent 1-mana Siphon Mines in most cases, but it creates a vulnerability. Killing Hollow Marauder when it was targeted with a Grave Flicker is how I've stopped other versions of the deck, so that makes complete sense to me. To me, it seems discard strategies are succeeding or failing based on their draw engine, rather than their discard. Decks still need interaction to stall though. They can't all be engine pieces, so instead of adding discard, let's transition to talking about edicts. An edict is a term that refers to an effect that causes an opponent to sacrifice a creature. What brings this into the group Slug conversation is that Pauper Commander is filled with many mana efficient effects that make each player or opponent sacrifice a creature. There's quite a bit of overlap between discard and edicts. What makes the largest difference in my eyes is that removal and edicts are a tempo play. Cards in play represent a mana investment, while cards in hand do not. I've also considered that if an opponent were to discard something like Spirited Companion, they could have turned that card into a body and a card if they were to play it. Despite this, I found that edicts still effectively slow down the game, while discard doesn't. I think this is because tempo is much more important to the format than raw card advantage. Not that card advantage isn't important. Part of that is that I found it easier to break parity with edicts than I have with discard. It's hard to include discard and compete with decks focusing on draw, but with edicts, bare bodies are easier to come by with little preparation. They're also often enablers for commanders that want to change zones like Hollow Marauder that I mentioned earlier. Getting sacrificed allows Hollow Marauder to trigger again when it's replayed, and the edict effect can come with a body that also ends up in the graveyard to make it cheaper. The fact that edicts come with a body makes them much more synergistic. Creatures are easier to recur, and more cards just care about creatures than instants or sorceries. For example, it allows them to work with recursion like Grave Flickers or Dread Return. Comparing this to discard, there are more discard effects on bodies, and they're usually cheaper than edicts. There's only 1 2-mana enters the battlefield edict creature as of writing this, and there's at least 5 2-mana discard creatures, but it's still not worth it to play mass discard. Meanwhile, edict creatures almost always seem to earn their slot, even at 4 or 5 mana. There is one creature with a Dies Trigger edict effect, and it's even 2 mana. It's Abyssal Gatekeeper, and it's frequently excluded from decks that load up on the enters the battlefield edict creatures, because it can't be used to pay for its own edict like all the others. That means if I'm trying to protect my commander and sacrifice my own Abyssal Gatekeeper, I need 1 more disposable creature between the effect and my commander. I suspect that more decks will include this in the future, as they become more refined and want to maximize efficiency. Before I pivot away from edict creatures, it's worth mentioning that a Cursed Marauder and Chain Devil only allow opponents to sacrifice a non-token creature, which gets around what used to be an effective way to hedge against edicts. Extract a Confession is a non-creature card that can also impose a restriction on which creature can be sacrificed, which I've found to be quite effective. It doesn't come with a creature, but it makes up for it by not making its controller sacrifice. Innocent Blood on the other hand does not. It's dirt cheap at 1 mana, but the spell's controller also has to sacrifice too, so it's actually card disadvantage. I still include it in some decks though, with strong creature engines. Tithing Blade is a personal favorite of mine. It comes on an artifact, which some decks really care about, and I've activated its craftability in tournaments with my Sphinx Summoner deck fairly often, and the life gain has been nice. Orkiel's Edict is too inconsistent to be played now. Vraska's Fall is 3 mana, and its notable quality is that it's instant. I found that Edicts are a rare exception that don't need to be instant, like most other removal spells, to be effective, so it being instant for me is more about being able to play a draw spell instead. The last thing I'll say about Edicts is that again, like Discard, because they can't exclude an opponent, if you're playing an Edict to slow down a combo, and we're expecting help from the aggro player, you've slowed them down as well. To combat this, deck builders should be intentional when choosing their removal. Even though Extracted Confession has a larger impact on the game, a targeted kill spell may be more likely to lead to a game win. I've seen this logic applied to Discard too, but I'll be honest, I have not been convinced enough to start slotting Hymn to Turok into decks. The effectiveness of Edicts has led to their proliferation through the meta to the point that I think all decks should include countermeasures or they're going to have a bad time. That could be spare bodies, like token generators or creatures that replace themselves, playing additional mana sources for replaying the commander, a reliable source of bodies. This tends to work better with commanders that don't need to tap or attack to accrue value. Or you could fully lean in and play an enter or leaves the battlefield commander along with your own Edicts. Counterspells can also act as a countermeasure, but they don't typically provide extra value like extra bodies and mana sources do. Plus, it feels bad using a resource to save the creatures of the other two players. To next level the counter to Edicts, we should move on to the next key part of Pauper Commander Group Slug: board wipes. Almost all of Pauper Commander's board wipes come in the form of damage, so they can't deal with large creatures. That makes Edicts and board wipes go together nicely. The board wipes clear out the small creatures, and the Edicts finish off whatever's left. It's this synergy that I think gives Pauper Commander Group Slug its identity. The more cards from the package get included, the more consistently they work, including if opponents are playing them. There are plenty of effects that deal 1 damage to each creature. I'm not going to go into every one of them because they are often excluded from lists for not being potent enough, and the Festivities and Tectonic Hazard are as cheap as they come at 1 mana, are asymmetrical, and they even hit opponents' life totals too. Upgrading to instant with Electricity increases the cost to 2 mana, and if you're willing to pay 2 mana and still have it sorcery, there's a few options. But board wipes aren't something that needs to be played on curve usually, so it's more important that they have a higher impact. Suffocating Fumes is my personal favorite. It doesn't deal damage, but instead gives opponents' creatures -1/-1 for a turn, which is very relevant in combat. It's instant, so it makes your creatures take less damage and trade better, which can be a blowout. Regardless, it can greatly reduce the damage if many creatures are attacking you. The cycling is what pushes this over the top for me though. It just makes it very easy to keep in a deck and keeps putting in work for me. Will of the Nim is right up there with it though. Unlike Suffocating Fumes, Will of the Nim hits your own creatures, but that's mitigated entirely by the fact that it can also regenerate them. A common conundrum with including board wipes in a deck is that if it runs its own small creatures, it doesn't want to set itself back. When played in combat, your regeneration shields allow you to block without hesitation and still have your creatures emerge unscathed. At sorcery speed, Barrage of Boulders, Cosmotronic Wave, and Hazardous Blast prevent opponents from blocking for a turn, which can easily be a win condition. Honestly, these are more often played for the evasion, and the damage is just an afterthought. The ones that come with creatures are too expensive to fit into most decks, like with Subterranean Shambler, Bing Dragon, and Boiling Earth. Gouge Zealot caught my eye because it's repeatable, but Delirium is more work than I'm willing to do. There's a few that require you to sacrifice the creature, or work when it dies, like Bloodfire Dwarf, Deathhead's Buzzard, and Fester Creep, but the only reason I would run these is to try and recur them, and I don't like the effect on its own enough the first time to want to spend additional resources playing it a second time. Instead, I'm more likely to reach for a 2 damage board wipe. Fiery Cannonade and Breath Weapons are the default options in my book. They're as cheap as they come at 3 mana, and are instant speed. Their conditions don't usually matter, except if you plan to see Malcolm Keen-Eyed Navigator, in which case Breath Weapon becomes the default. Dragons are not very played in this format. Very similarly, Sulphurous Blast is an option for 1 additional mana that adds the option of being a 3 damage board wipe at sorcery speed, which is pretty exceptional. If you want to go past that, you either need something that scales, which we'll get into later, or have restrictions like Claws of Wirewood only hitting flyers, or Swirling Sandstorm that hits non-flyers. Both of these are seldom played though for being too narrow. For other 2 damage board wipes outside red, Drown in Sorrow seems like it would be the obvious choice, but I famously don't think Scry is very useful, and it makes sequencing your turn very difficult because it's sorcery speed. Sometimes I like playing a board wipe before an attack to clear out jump blockers, but this shrinks the power of my remaining attackers. Not all decks care about that though, in which case this can be a great efficient option. Arms of Hadar initially seems like a worse card because it only affects 1 opponent and costs an extra mana, but the fact that it doesn't hit your own creatures is huge. We've also discussed the scenario where you don't want to hurt another player that's helping kill a threatening opponent, which makes this being targeted all the more desirable. Evenkar's Justice is one of the stronger options. It deals damage to all creatures and players. Compared to Drown in Sorrow, it's easier to attack on the turn you play it because the unblocked attackers still deal the same amount of damage. Evenkar's Justice can win on its own though. I've won more than one game by buying this back every turn because I'm at a higher life total than my opponents, and they were all relying on small creatures. When I'm sitting on the other side of the table and playing against Evenkar's Justice though, if I have a bunch of small creatures in hand, whatever lived through the Evenkar's Justice is going to work on killing the player still holding the Evenkar's. The more pressure you put on them, the less they want to play it. Because of this, I sometimes opt to not buy it back despite having the resources. It's a very skill-testing card. One of my favorite modes for this card is to play it with buyback, and then play it without buyback to do 4 damage to everything. It's 11 mana, but it just reminds me about how many options this card can give. The rest of the notable board wipes scale. Bloodfire Infusion is a really weird card, but I love it. It's a creature aura, but it can be activated at instant speed, which is a great way to threaten people. It's not good in everything, but has homes where it's really powerful. It's really nice having the choice to put it on either a small creature and leave your larger ones, or just throwing it on your biggest creature to wipe everything. Heartclan Shaman affects non-flyers like other board wipes I said were too narrow to see play earlier. Heartclan Shaman also requires disposable artifacts to work, but it's better than the other conditional board wipes for a few reasons. It can be activated multiple times to scale as needed, but activating it usually kills Heartclan Shaman. But if it gains flying or higher toughness, it's possible to board wipe multiple times, which can really lock down a game. Crypt is similar, but only requires black mana to work, and it affects all creatures and players, regardless if they fly or not. The low barrier to include in a deck and scaling potential make this generically good. Like Heartclan Shaman, Cryptrat's ability kills itself, but with a little work, you can have a scaling repeatable board wipe. Additionally, if it gains Death Touch, it kills all creatures. Indestructible and Grave Flickers make it repeatable, and Lifelink is crazy on creature board wipes. With no creatures and 3 opponents, a lifelink in Cryptrats will gain 4 times the damage done because Cryptrats damages itself and each player. But there are usually a bunch of creatures in play that all multiply how much damage is done, so it gets out of hand quickly. Most of the time, Cryptrats represents a loss of life though. That can help close out the game, or be a liability, just like the others. Pestilence has that same problem. It deals damage to everything, but it's an enchantment, so not only can it not get lifelink, it's a lot easier to keep around from turn to turn. That's extremely powerful, but it also comes at the cost of putting a huge target on your back. And like Evenkar's Justice, the simplest way to get someone to stop activating Pestilence is to pressure their life total, and just kill them. That can be fine if you're at the point where you can just control everyone until you can close out the game, which Pestilence helps with a great deal, as long as your life total is greater than your opponent's. So let's use that as a transition to the next type of spell that I classify as Group Slug. Damage. I defined Group Slug as an antonym for Group Hug, so any shared loss of a resource, including life, fits my definition. Board wipes that deal damage to players fit this very well, but more dedicated cards like Flame Rift or Crushing Disappointment do as well. I won't get into all of them here, but I'll just reiterate that like with all Group Slug mechanics, the first thing in your mind should be how you break parity. If you want more information on this, check out my video on pingers. Other board wipes that hit enchantments kind of qualify as Group Slug, but they're not what I think of. Plus, they're also too narrow for me to include in most of my decks. In practice, Group Slug can be an effective way of slowing down a game. I see mass discard as a trap in most circumstances, but Edicts are ubiquitous in black for their high impact and ability to synergize. Board wipes strengthen Edicts while being independently powerful, and often help close out a game. Brewers should always consider how they're going to break parity, so they can come out on top with more life or creatures. The good Group Slug cards often double as ways to win the game, or forward your own game plan. Leave a comment down below if you disagree, think I missed something, or if you'd like to link your own Pauper Commander Group Slug deck for other enthusiasts to enjoy. Thanks for watching. For more information about this format, check out the rest of my channel. I use all of my Patreon money plus some out of my own pocket to run this channel and promote this format. To contribute, please give this video a like and subscribe for more Pauper Commander content. If you'd like to support what I'm doing here more directly, I'd love it if you became a patron. Patreon shoutout to Achu, I've Cryptid, Ryan Bernheisel, and Bill. Too much too. Thank you.